I am Claire Sterling. If you're listening from somewhere far away, drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this has traveled. And please, stay with me until the end. Looking back, the most terrifying part of deception isn't the lie itself. It's how comfortably it sits at your dinner table. It pours your coffee, asks about your day, and sleeps beside you in a bed you paid for. For years, I lived in a reality that was meticulously constructed to keep me productive, compliant, and completely blind. To the outside world, the Harrington family was a pillar of New York real estate. My parents, Richard and Eleanor, were the architects of this empire, gracing the covers of business magazines and hosting charity galas that dictated the social calendar of the elite. But inside the walls of Harrington Real Estate Group, the reality was entirely different. They were the figureheads. I was the engine. At 36 as the executive vice president, I was the one pulling 16-hour shifts, navigating the brutal zoning laws, placating furious investors, and keeping the company from collapsing under the weight of my parents' increasingly lavish lifestyle. And then there was my husband, Julian. At 38, Julian was the director of business development. That was his official title, anyway. In practice, his role consisted of wearing immaculately tailored Tom Ford suits, playing 18 holes of golf with prospective clients, and charming my parents. I fell in love with him 7 years ago because he offered a softness I desperately craved. I grew up in a house where love was conditional, transactional, and usually reserved for my younger sister. Julian made me feel seen. He brought me takeout when I worked until midnight. He rubbed my shoulders and told me I was the smartest woman in the room. I didn't realize until much later that he wasn't admiring my intellect. He was assessing my utility. It was a Tuesday in late October when the first crack appeared in my perfect, exhausting life. The day had been relentlessly punishing. We were in the final stages of securing a massive commercial development deal in Lower Manhattan, a project that would secure the company's financials for the next decade. My father had spent the morning complaining about the profit margins before leaving at noon for a vital networking lunch at his private club. Julian had kissed my cheek around 2 in the afternoon, his golf club slung over his shoulder, claiming he had to court a hesitant Japanese investor at the country club. "Don't work too late, honey," he had murmured, his breath smelling faintly of peppermint and expensive espresso. "I'll have dinner waiting for you." I had smiled, leaning into his touch for a brief second before turning back to my spreadsheets. An hour later, my sister waltzed into my office. Chloe was 26, a full 10 years younger than me, and the undisputed golden child of the Harrington family. If I was the draft horse pulling the carriage, Chloe was the prize-winning show pony sitting inside it. She had never held a real job, unless you counted her brief, disastrous stint as a lifestyle influencer, fully funded by our parents. She possessed my mother's delicate, striking features and my father's absolute allergy to hard work. "Hey," she said, dropping shopping bags from Bergdorf Goodman onto my leather sofa. She was wearing a cashmere sweater that cost more than most people's monthly rent. "Mom said you needed to approve this invoice for my apartment's interior designer. The contractor is threatening to pause the renovation." I pinched the bridge of my nose, fighting off a migraine. "Chloe, we talked about this. The renovation budget was capped at $100,000. This invoice pushes it past $200. She rolled her eyes, a gesture she had perfected since she was 12. "It's not my fault Italian marble went up in price. Besides, Julian said it was a smart investment. He told me yesterday that property values in Tribeca demand high-end finishes. He actually helped me pick out the tile." I paused, my pen hovering over the document. "Julian went tile shopping with you yesterday? He told me he was in back-to-back meetings." Chloe didn't miss a beat. She flipped her blonde hair over her shoulder, looking at her perfectly manicured nails. "It was just during his lunch break. He was in the neighborhood. Honestly, you're so lucky to have him. He's the only one who actually listens to me without giving me a lecture." A familiar pang of guilt twisted in my stomach. The guilt was an old friend, carefully cultivated by my parents since childhood. "You're too harsh. You're too serious. You need to be softer with your sister." I signed the invoice. It was easier to authorize the transfer from my personal executive account than to deal with the inevitable phone call from my mother, accusing me of stifling my sister's happiness. Thanks, Chloe chirped, snatching the paper. See you at the gala next week. Try to find a dress that isn't black this time, okay? You look like a widow. She left, leaving behind a cloud of expensive perfume. I stayed at the office until 9 o'clock that night. The building was empty, the quiet hum of the HVAC system my only companion. As I finally packed up my briefcase, my phone buzzed with an alert from the weather app. An unseasonably early and severe blizzard was hitting Colorado, specifically the Aspen area. The Harrington family owned a sprawling log cabin in Aspen. It was our winter retreat, though I hadn't been there in 3 years because I was always too busy working to take a vacation. Julian, however, visited frequently. He called it his focus space for writing quarterly strategies. I sat back down at my desk, pulling up the smart home application on my iPad. A few winters ago, a pipe had burst in the cabin because the heat had been turned down too low, causing $70,000 in water damage. Since then, I had installed a comprehensive smart system, thermostats, leak detectors, and interior security cameras. Nobody in the family bothered to learn how to use the app except me. Naturally, the responsibility of maintaining the property fell squarely on my shoulders. I tapped the screen, intending only to check the ambient temperature in the main living room and turn up the digital thermostat to keep the pipes from freezing. The app loaded slowly due to the heavy snow affecting the connection. The screen blinked, and the live feed from the living room camera materialized. The temperature reading in the corner said it was a comfortable 72 degrees. The fireplace was roaring, casting a warm, flickering orange glow across the rustic hardwood floors and the massive leather sectional sofa. There was a bottle of Dom Perignon chilling in a silver bucket on the coffee table. 2 half-empty crystal flutes sat next to it. And then I saw them. My brain, usually so adept at processing complex data and finding logical solutions, simply stalled. It refused to translate the visual information into reality. I stared at the high-definition screen, my breath catching in my throat, a cold, heavy numbness spreading from the center of my chest down to my fingertips. Julian was on the sofa. He wasn't wearing his Tom Ford suit. He wasn't playing golf with a Japanese investor in New York. He was in Aspen, and he wasn't alone. Straddling him, her back to the camera, was a woman. Her blonde hair, the exact shade of spun gold, tumbled down her bare back. Even without seeing her face, I knew the curve of her shoulders, the way she tossed her head back when she laughed. I had brushed that hair when we were children. I had paid for the extensions last month. It was Chloe. My husband and my little sister. I didn't scream. I didn't throw the iPad. I sat perfectly still in the sterile fluorescent light of my corner office, entirely paralyzed. The physical sensation was indescribable. It felt as though the floor had completely vanished beneath my chair, leaving me in a terrifying, silent freefall. My mouth tasted like pennies. I watched them, these 2 people I had clothed, fed, and supported, moving together in the firelight of the house I maintained. A nauseating puzzle began piecing itself together in my mind. The golf games, the business trips, the way Julian always defended Chloe's spending, the way Chloe always managed to know his schedule. I had been subsidizing my husband's affair with my own sister. My hand trembled violently as I reached out to close the application. I wanted to shut it off. I wanted to rewind the clock to 10 minutes ago when my biggest problem was a zoning permit in Manhattan. But before my finger could touch the screen, a sound came through the iPad speaker. The camera in the living room had a built-in microphone, highly sensitive to pick up the sound of shattering glass for security purposes. Julian's cell phone, resting on the coffee table near the microphone, began to ring. On the screen, I watched Julian gently push Chloe off him. He reached over, picked up the phone, and glanced at the screen. He said something to Chloe, a smile playing on his lips, and tapped the button to answer, putting it on speakerphone before tossing it back onto the table so he could pull her back into his arms. "Julian, darling," a voice echoed through the iPad speaker, filling my silent New York office. It was a voice I had heard every day of my life. Elegant, cultured, with that slight practiced rasp she acquired after a glass of Merlot. It was Eleanor, my mother. My blood turned to ice water. I leaned closer to the iPad, holding my breath, terrified that the sound of my own heartbeat would somehow transmit through the miles and alert them. "Hi, Eleanor," Julian said, his voice smooth, relaxed, entirely unbothered. "We're just settling in. The storm is getting pretty bad outside." "I saw the forecast," my mother replied, her tone completely casual, conversational. "Is Chloe warm enough? You know how she hates the cold." "I'm keeping her very warm, Mom," Chloe chimed in, giggling as she leaned toward the phone. I squeezed my eyes shut. "Mom." She was talking to our mother while naked with my husband. "Good," my mother said. There was no shock, no outrage, just the mild satisfaction of a woman checking off a grocery list. "Now listen to me carefully, Julian. Claire's assistant forwarded me her itinerary. She finalized the Lower Manhattan deal today, which means she might decide to fly out there this weekend to check on the property since she has a rare few days off. You need to make sure you have the cleaning service come in on Thursday." "Already booked them, Eleanor," Julian replied, kissing Chloe's neck. "Don't worry. There won't be a single blonde hair left on the carpets." "Make sure they change all the linens," my mother instructed, her voice dropping into a conspiratorial whisper. "You know how meticulous she is. If she smells Chloe's perfume on those pillows, she'll lose her mind. And we cannot afford Claire having a meltdown right now. The board relies on her stability." "I've got it handled," Julian assured her. "Good boy," my mother praised him. "Oh, and Julian, make sure you take Chloe out to that nice jewelry store in town before you fly back. Keep her happy. If she's in a good mood this weekend, I'm going to corner Claire at the Sunday dinner and guilt her into releasing the funds from the trust for Chloe's new Porsche. I'll tell her it's crucial for Chloe's mental health recovery after her last breakup." Chloe laughed, a sharp, delighted sound that felt like a physical blow to my ribs. "You're the best, Mom. Tell Dad I want the interior in red." "I will, sweetheart. Have fun, you two. Be discreet on the flight back." The call disconnected. The silence in my office was deafening. The live feed continued to play, showing them resuming their activities on the sofa, but I couldn't see them anymore. My vision had completely blurred. If discovering the affair was a stab to the heart, my mother's voice on that phone call was a slow, deliberate twist of the blade, followed by the pouring of acid into the wound. This wasn't just an affair. It wasn't a moment of weakness or a secret betrayal between two selfish people. This was a systemic, family-sanctioned conspiracy. My mother knew. My father undoubtedly knew too. They didn't just know, they facilitated it. They used my husband to keep their favorite daughter entertained, and they used me, the unloved, pragmatic workhorse, to fund the entire operation. They viewed my marriage, my loyalty, and my bank account as nothing more than resources to be exploited to keep the peace and maintain their luxurious lifestyle. I looked around my office, at the stacks of contracts I had fought for, at the framed awards on the wall that belonged to a company bearing a name that now tasted like poison. I had spent my entire adult life trying to earn the love of parents who were actively plotting against me with my own husband. I didn't cry. The sorrow was there, vast and deep, but it was rapidly being suffocated by something else. Something cold, precise, and entirely foreign to the woman I had been an hour ago. I carefully reached out and hit the record button on the smart home application. I watched the little red dot pulse in the corner of the screen, capturing every movement, every sound, saving it directly to my secure cloud server. They thought I was just the machine that printed their money. They thought because I was responsible, I was weak. They assumed my dedication to the family name would always override my self-respect. They were about to find out exactly what happens when the machine stops working for them and starts working against them. I didn't leave my office until the recording was safely encrypted and backed up in 3 separate secure cloud locations. I sat in the dim light of my office for a long time, watching the New York skyline glitter through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The city looked exactly the same as it had an hour ago, yet my entire universe had shifted on its axis. When I finally stood up, my legs felt like lead. I walked out of the Harrington Real Estate Group headquarters, the building my sweat and blood had kept afloat, and handed my parking ticket to the valet. The cold October wind whipped through my wool coat as I waited for my car. I didn't feel the chill. I didn't feel much of anything, just a hollow, ringing sensation in my ears, like the aftermath of a bomb detonating in a closed room. I drove straight to the Upper East Side. My parents lived in a massive, historic limestone townhouse just off Fifth Avenue. It was a monument to their ego, purchased with the profits of my first major solo acquisition 7 years ago. As I pulled up to the curb, I looked at the warmly lit windows on the second floor. That was my father's study. There was a tiny, pathetic, childlike sliver of hope still clinging to life inside my chest. It was the part of me that still believed in the fundamental laws of nature, that a mother protects her young, that a father defends his daughter's honor. I told myself that perhaps I had misheard the context of the call. Perhaps they were being blackmailed. Perhaps when faced with the undeniable, visceral proof of what my husband was doing to me with my own sister, the facade would break, and my parents would finally wrap their arms around me and beg for my forgiveness. I unlocked the heavy mahogany front door with my key and bypassed the grand staircase, taking the private elevator up to the second floor. The study door was slightly ajar. I pushed it open. The room smelled intensely of old paper, lemon polish, and the expensive Macallan scotch my father poured religiously every night at 10. Richard was sitting in his leather wingback chair, nursing a crystal tumbler, while Eleanor lounged on the velvet chaise, flipping through an auction catalog. They looked like a photograph from a lifestyle magazine, the perfect, wealthy, unbothered New York couple. "Claire?" My mother looked up, her perfectly arched eyebrows drawing together in mild annoyance. "What on earth are you doing here at this hour? You look dreadful. Didn't I tell you to stop wearing that severe black trench coat?" I didn't answer. I walked slowly across the Persian rug, the silence in the room thickening with every step I took. I reached my father's massive mahogany desk, pulled my iPad from my tote bag, and set it down in the center of the blotter. "I checked the security cameras at the Aspen cabin tonight," I said. My voice didn't sound like my own. It was a dry, raspy whisper. "To make sure the pipes weren't freezing." My father paused, his glass halfway to his lips. My mother slowly lowered the auction catalog. For a fraction of a second, I saw a flicker of something cross her face. Not guilt, but the sharp, calculating calculation of a chess player who just realized they left their queen exposed. I reached out and tapped the screen. The video wasn't just the live feed. It was the recording I had saved. The bright, high-definition image of Julian and Chloe intertwined on the leather sofa illuminated the dark wood of the study. And then the audio played. The sound of the ringing phone. Julian answering. And my mother's elegant, rasping voice giving instructions on how to hide the evidence of my husband's infidelity with my sister. "Make sure they change all the linens. If she smells Chloe's perfume on those pillows, she'll lose her mind." I let the recording play until the call disconnected. Then I hit stop. The silence that followed was so absolute, so heavy, it felt like the air pressure in the room had suddenly dropped. I stood there, my hands trembling at my sides, waiting for the explosion. I waited for my father to throw his glass against the wall in a rage at Julian. I waited for my mother to burst into tears of shame. Instead, my father sighed. It was a long, tired exhalation, the kind of sigh he gave when a contractor missed a deadline. He set his scotch down on a coaster. My mother elegantly uncrossed her legs, adjusted the cashmere throw over her lap, and looked directly at me. "I specifically told Julian to be careful with the smart home system," Eleanor said, her voice laced with nothing more than mild irritation. "He assured me he had disabled the interior lenses. The man is entirely too careless with technology." The sliver of hope in my chest didn't just die, it was incinerated. "You told him to be careful," I repeated, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. "That is your response? He is sleeping with Chloe, your daughter, my sister. My husband is sleeping with my sister in our family home, and your only regret is that he forgot to unplug the camera?" "Oh, for heaven's sake, Claire, lower your voice. The staff is sleeping," my mother snapped, standing up. She walked over to the desk and snapped the iPad cover shut, as if closing the case on a minor inconvenience. "You are being hysterical." "Hysterical?" A ragged, broken laugh escaped my throat. Tears, hot and furious, finally breached my eyelashes, spilling down my cheeks. "Mom, he is committing adultery with Chloe. You orchestrated the cover-up. How long? How long have you known about this?" "Since the summer," my father answered flatly, not looking at me. He picked up his scotch again. "And it is not a cover-up, Claire. It is damage control." I stared at the man who had walked me down the aisle 7 years ago. Damage control? By letting my husband use my money to take my sister on romantic getaways? By telling me I need to buy her a Porsche? "Listen to me and listen to me closely," my mother said, stepping around the desk to stand inches from my face. There was no maternal warmth in her eyes, only a cold, hard pragmatism that chilled me to the bone. "Chloe is fragile. You know how deeply that last breakup damaged her self-esteem. She has always felt overshadowed by you. You have the career, the brilliant mind, the stable marriage. Chloe had nothing. Julian makes her feel special. He listens to her." "He's my husband!" I screamed, finally losing my grip on the professional composure I had worn like armor for a decade. "He is my husband, Mom! You don't give a woman's husband to her sister like a hand-me-down designer bag just because she's feeling insecure." "He is also," my father interrupted, his voice booming over mine, "the director of business development. Do you have any idea how close he is to closing the Vanguard account? Do you know what a scandal like this would do to our stock price if it leaked? If you file for divorce, if you drag your sister's name through the mud, the board of directors will panic. The Vanguard investors are highly conservative. They will pull out. The company cannot afford a public, messy family implosion right now." I looked back and forth between them. The tears were flowing freely now, blurring their faces. They weren't looking at a daughter whose heart had just been ripped out of her chest. They were looking at a PR liability. They were managing an asset. "So, what?" I choked out, my chest heaving as I struggled for oxygen. "What is the plan, Richard? I just smile? I just go home, wash his clothes, and pretend I don't know he's sleeping with my little sister so your stock options don't take a hit? So Chloe can have a confidence boost?" "It is a phase, Claire," Eleanor said smoothly, reaching out to pat my arm. I flinched violently, stepping back from her touch. "Julian is a man. Men get bored. And frankly, darling, you haven't exactly been the most attentive wife lately. You work 16 hours a day. You're always stressed. You wear black. You never want to entertain. Chloe is bright. She's fun. She's available. You cannot entirely blame Julian for seeking out a little warmth when his own home is an icebox." There it was, the ultimate betrayal. They weren't just protecting Chloe. They were actively blaming me for my own husband's infidelity. They were using my dedication to their company, the very dedication that kept a roof over their heads and funded Chloe's exorbitant lifestyle, as the weapon to justify my abuse. In that opulent mahogany-paneled room surrounded by millions of dollars of art and antiques, I experienced a profound, terrifying moment of clarity. I was an orphan. I had living parents, breathing the same air as me, standing 3 feet away, but I had no mother and no father. I was completely, utterly alone in the world. I was nothing more than a beast of burden to them, a shield to protect their fragile golden child, and an ATM to fund their illusions of grandeur. If I died tomorrow, their only concern would be finding someone else to approve the invoices. The tears stopped. It was a physical sensation, like a valve shutting off in my brain. The hysterical, agonizing grief that had been threatening to drown me suddenly evaporated, leaving behind a vast, frozen wasteland. In the center of that wasteland, a tiny spark of pure, concentrated rage ignited. I realized in that fraction of a second that if I fought them now, if I screamed, threatened divorce, or threatened to expose them, they would destroy me. My father still held the majority voting rights on the board. They would spin the narrative. They would call me crazy, unstable, jealous of my beautiful younger sister. They would fire me from the company I built, lock me out of the family trusts, and Julian would walk away with half of my assets and my sister on his arm. I could not fight them with emotion. I had to fight them with strategy. I had to be exactly the cold, calculating machine they accused me of being. I took a deep, shuddering breath. I let my shoulders slump forward, deliberately destroying my perfect posture. I bowed my head, looking down at the Persian rug, forcing my breathing to sound jagged and defeated. "You're right," I whispered. The silence in the room shifted. The hostility vanished, replaced by a cautious, victorious relief. "What did you say, darling?" my mother asked, her tone instantly softening into a facsimile of maternal concern. I slowly raised my head. I widened my eyes, letting them look red and pathetic. "I said you're right. I've been so obsessed with the Lower Manhattan deal. I haven't been there for him. I haven't been a good wife." My father exhaled, a long, satisfied sound. He walked over and poured another splash of scotch into his glass. "It takes a big person to admit their faults, Claire. We all make mistakes." "I was just so shocked," I continued, forcing my voice to tremble. "Seeing them like that? It hurt, Mom. It hurt so much." "I know it did, sweetheart," Eleanor cooed, finally stepping forward and wrapping her arms around me. Her perfume smelled like lilies and deception. I held my breath to keep from gagging, allowing myself to hang limp in her embrace. "But you have to look at the bigger picture. Julian loves you. He built a life with you. Chloe is just a distraction, a momentary lapse in judgment for both of them. If you make a scene, you push him away forever. If you are patient, if you are warm and forgiving, he will come back to you when this burns out, and the family remains intact." "And the Vanguard deal?" I asked meekly, looking over her shoulder at my father. "Safe and sound," Richard smiled. "You're doing the right thing for the company, Claire. I'm proud of you." "I won't say anything," I promised, stepping back from my mother's toxic embrace. I picked up my iPad, my fingers wrapping tightly around the cold metal casing. "I'll go home. I'll try to be better. I'll make him a nice dinner when he gets back from Aspen." "That's my good girl," Eleanor smiled, her eyes gleaming with the satisfaction of a master manipulator who had just successfully reined in her most useful puppet. "Go get some rest. We'll see you at Sunday dinner. And remember not a word to Chloe. She would be mortified if she knew you saw her like that." Mortified. The word echoed in my mind. Oh, I intended to make her far more than mortified. "Not a word," I agreed. I turned and walked out of the study. I walked down the grand staircase, my heels clicking rhythmically against the marble, a steady, measured beat. I didn't rush. I didn't run. I walked with the deliberate grace of an executioner ascending the scaffold. When I stepped back out into the freezing New York night, the air felt different. It felt crisp, clean, and full of oxygen. I got into my car, locked the doors, and sat in the driver's seat. I didn't turn on the engine. Instead, I pulled out my phone. It was almost midnight. I scrolled past Julian's name, past my parents' numbers, past the emergency contacts for the Harrington Real Estate Board. I scrolled down to a number I had only used twice before, both times to politely decline aggressive headhunting offers. I pressed dial and put the phone to my ear. It rang twice before a sharp, awake voice answered. "Victoria Vance speaking." Victoria Vance was a self-made billionaire, a ruthless venture capitalist, and the single largest financial partner the Harrington Group had. She was 60 years old, sharp as a scalpel, and had famously built her empire after her own husband tried to steal her startup in a messy divorce in the 90s. She didn't suffer fools, and she had never particularly liked my father, but she tolerated him because she respected my margins. "Victoria, it's Claire Sterling," I said, my voice completely steady. The tremor was gone. The tears were gone. There was a brief pause on the line. "Claire, it's midnight on a Tuesday. I assume you aren't calling to discuss the interest rates on the Lower Manhattan project." "No," I replied, staring at the glowing windows of my parents' townhouse. "I'm calling because I need to build a shadow firm. I need to quietly redirect a $37 million portfolio over the next 2 months. And I need a partner who knows how to legally eviscerate a corporate board without leaving fingerprints." Victoria didn't miss a beat. The silence on the phone was electric. vibrating with sudden, intense interest. "How much time do we have before they realize they're bleeding out?" she asked. "Until Christmas," I said, my lips curving into the first genuine smile I had worn all day. It was a terrifying smile. "We have until the Christmas gala." "I'll have my driver pick you up in 10 minutes, Victoria said smoothly. "My penthouse. Bring your encrypted drives, Claire. Let's go hunting." I hung up the phone. I looked up at the second-floor window one last time, watching the silhouette of my father pacing with his scotch. They thought they had secured their empire by demanding my silence. They didn't realize that in forcing me to swallow my grief, they had effectively forged me into a weapon. They wanted me to be the silent, dutiful workhorse. I was going to be the architect of their absolute destruction. November arrived in New York with a bitter, biting chill that stripped the trees in Central Park bare. It was fitting weather for the season of my life. The hardest part of executing a flawless demolition isn't the explosion itself. It's the tedious, agonizing week spent laying the dynamite while smiling at the people who live in the building. For the next 2 months, my life became a masterclass in psychological compartmentalization. I had to split my consciousness in two. During the day, I was the loyal daughter and the devoted, slightly chastened wife. When Julian returned from Aspen that Thursday, his skin glowing with the crisp mountain air and his eyes holding that lazy, satisfied glint, I was waiting in our Upper West Side apartment with a perfectly roasted chicken and a bottle of his favorite Bordeaux. When he wrapped his arms around my waist from behind as I stood at the kitchen island, kissing the side of my neck, every muscle in my body screamed in visceral revulsion. I could smell the faint, lingering scent of my sister's expensive vanilla perfume mixed into the fabric of his cashmere sweater. My stomach violently rebelled, but I forced a soft, compliant smile onto my face. I leaned back against him, closing my eyes so he couldn't see the absolute deadness in them. "I missed you," he murmured, his hands sliding down to rest on my hips. Aspen was productive, but lonely. "I missed you too," I lied, my voice smooth and even. "I'm sorry I've been so distracted with work lately. I'm going to make more time for us." He turned me around, looking at me with a patronizing, affectionate smile that made me want to drive a steak knife through his hand. "That's all I've ever wanted, Claire. You work too hard for a family that doesn't appreciate you enough." The sheer, breathtaking audacity of the statement almost made me laugh out loud. He was standing in a kitchen I paid for, wearing a watch I bought him, fresh from sleeping with my sister with my mother's blessing, and he was playing the role of my sympathetic protector. But that was the Julian Sterling method. Gaslight the victim so thoroughly that she thanks you for holding the match. While the dutiful wife cooked dinners and attended Sunday brunches at my parents' townhouse, the other half of my consciousness, the architect of their ruin, was working frantically in the shadows. Every night, after Julian fell asleep, I would slip out of bed, take my encrypted laptop into the guest bathroom, turn on the shower to muffle the sound of my typing, and go to war. My primary weapon, aside from Victoria Vance's bottomless legal resources, was Sam Jenkins. Sam was 28 years old, brilliant, neurodivergent, and the head of internal IT and data analytics at Harrington Real Estate Group. 2 years ago, when Sam's mother was diagnosed with aggressive stage 3 breast cancer and his terrible corporate insurance refused to cover the experimental treatments she needed, my parents had told him to start a GoFundMe. Instead, I quietly paid the $80,000 medical bill out of my personal executive account. I didn't do it to buy his loyalty. I did it because it was the right thing to do. But in doing so, I had inadvertently bought the absolute, unwavering devotion of the most dangerous digital forensic mind in Manhattan. When I sat Sam down in Victoria's secure penthouse office and laid out the reality of what my husband, my sister, and my parents were doing, he didn't offer empty platitudes or pity. He simply cracked his knuckles, opened his laptop, and said, "What do we burn first?" Over the next 6 weeks, Sam and I meticulously mapped out the financial anatomy of the Harrington Empire. Victoria Vance brought in a team of ruthless, discreet forensic accountants who operated out of her firm, completely isolated from my family's network. What we found was far worse than a simple affair. It was a staggering ecosystem of greed. Julian wasn't just sleeping with Chloe, he was funding her entire existence, and he was using my father's ignorance to do it. My father, Richard, was supposed to oversee the budgets for our commercial developments in Brooklyn and Queens. But Richard spent 4 days a week at the country club, leaving the authorization of subcontractor invoices to Julian. Sam discovered a web of 3 shell companies: Apex Solutions, Horizon Logistics, and Vanguard Supply. They sounded like legitimate construction vendors, but a deep dive into their Delaware registration documents revealed that they were entirely fictitious entities controlled by Julian. Over the past 14 months, Julian had siphoned nearly $2.4 million of company funds by approving inflated or entirely fake invoices from these shell companies. And where was the money going? "Look at this," Sam said one evening in late November, pointing to a glowing spreadsheet on his monitor in Victoria's office. Apex Solutions wires $50,000 to a Cayman account every month. From there, it filters into a domestic trust. The beneficiary of that trust? Chloe Harrington. I stared at the screen, my jaw tight. He's stealing from my father's projects to pay for my sister's lifestyle. And your father is signing off on the quarterly loss reports without even reading the itemized deductions, Victoria noted, swirling a glass of bourbon. She looked at me with cold, predatory eyes. Your family is a house of cards, Claire. Julian is eating the foundation. Your sister is dancing on the roof, and your parents are too busy admiring the paint job to notice the termites. Can we prove Eleanor and Richard know about the embezzlement? I asked. Sam shook his head. No. The email suggests they think Julian is just a genius at finding tax loopholes to free up cash for Chloe. They are willfully ignorant, but Julian is the one committing the actual fraud. Let him, I said softly. Victoria raised an eyebrow. You want to let him keep stealing your family's money? It's not my family's money, I corrected her, a dark satisfaction blooming in my chest. As of 2 weeks ago, Richard leveraged those specific Brooklyn properties to secure a bridge loan from a federal bank. That means Julian isn't just stealing private corporate funds anymore. He's defrauding a federally insured institution. Victoria's lips curved into a slow, wicked smile. Wire fraud, bank fraud, money laundering. Exactly, I said. Thanksgiving arrived, a grotesque pantomime of family unity. We gathered at the long mahogany table in my parents' townhouse. The crystals sparkled, the silver gleamed, and the air was thick with the smell of roasted turkey, sage stuffing, and hypocrisy. I sat next to Julian, who spent the entire meal with his left hand resting warmly on my thigh, playing the devoted husband for the audience. Across the table sat Chloe, looking radiant in a silk emerald dress, occasionally catching Julian's eye and offering him a secret, conspiratorial smile. My mother presided over the feast like a queen, and my father held court, boasting about the upcoming Christmas gala. It's going to be the event of the season, Richard declared, raising his wine glass. We're announcing the restructuring of the executive board. It's time we inject some fresh, youthful energy into the upper echelons of Harrington Group. He meant Julian. He was going to name my cheating, embezzling husband as his successor right in front of me. Speaking of fresh energy, my mother chimed in, turning her predatory gaze toward me. Claire, darling, Chloe was telling me how much trouble she's been having with her car. It keeps breaking down on her way to the Hamptons. We were thinking, since you just secured that massive Vanguard bonus, it might be a wonderful gesture for you to help her upgrade. A new Porsche SUV would be so safe for her. The table went quiet. Julian squeezed my thigh under the table, a silent warning to play along. Chloe looked at me with wide, innocent eyes, the picture of a helpless younger sister. It was the exact conversation I had heard my mother planning on the Aspen security tape. They were actively executing their script, entirely unaware that I already knew all their lines. I looked at my mother. I looked at the woman who had instructed my husband on how to wash my sister's scent out of my sheets. I forced a gentle, sisterly smile onto my face. Of course, Mom, you're right. Chloe deserves something reliable. Have her go to the dealership in Manhattan on Monday, pick out whatever she wants, and have them send the wire transfer authorization to my office. I'll take care of it. Chloe squealed, clapping her hands together. Oh my God, Claire, really? Thank you. You're the best sister ever. You have no idea, I murmured, taking a sip of my wine. Julian leaned over and kissed my cheek. That was incredibly generous of you, Claire. I'm proud of you. I paid for the Porsche the following Tuesday. I authorized the transfer of $140,000 from my personal account. It physically nauseated me to part with the money, but Victoria had reminded me of the golden rule of entrapment. Never interrupt your enemy when they are making a mistake. The Porsche was a shiny, metallic piece of rope. I was just giving them enough to hang themselves. Because they thought they had me completely domesticated and subdued, Julian and Chloe grew increasingly sloppy. The thrill of the illicit affair was wearing off, replaced by an arrogant, lazy entitlement. They started taking longer lunches together. Julian's excuses for coming home late became flimsy and insulting. He stopped trying to hide his phone screen when he texted her. He believed he was untouchable. He believed my parents' protection was an impenetrable shield. And then, in the first week of December, Julian made the fatal mistake. The mistake that would ensure he wouldn't just lose his job and his marriage, but his freedom. It was a Tuesday afternoon. Sam Jenkins walked into my office, bypassed my desk entirely, and locked my office door. He strode over, pulled the blinds shut, and placed a thick manila folder on my desk. His face was pale, his eyes wide behind his wire-rimmed glasses. "What is it?" I asked, sitting up straight. "He crossed the line," Sam said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "Claire, he didn't just cross the line. He sprinted past it with a lit torch." I opened the folder. Inside were copies of legal documents, heavily stamped with notary seals from the state of Delaware. I scanned the first page, my eyes catching on my own name. It was a transfer of equity. Before we were married, my father had insisted Julian and I sign a prenup. But my father had also insisted on putting 10% of the Harrington Group's private voting shares into a joint trust for Julian and me as a wedding gift. Over the years, as the company's valuation exploded, those shares had become worth nearly $12 million. The document in my hands was a formal authorization to dissolve that joint trust and transfer the entirety of those shares into a newly created private holding company. The sole beneficiary of that holding company was Chloe Harrington. "He's transferring our joint equity to your sister," Sam explained, tracing a finger over the bottom of the second page. "But that's not the worst part. Look at the signature line." I looked down. There, perfectly executed in blue ink, was my signature. The sharp C, the looping L, the authoritative dash at the end of sterling. It was flawless, except I had never signed it. "He forged my signature," I whispered, the reality of the document sending a sudden electric jolt of adrenaline straight to my heart. "Yes," Sam said, pacing the length of my office. "He used the digital signature capture from your iPad that you use for internal memos, lifted the vector file, and printed it onto the hard copies using the high-res plotter in the drafting department. I caught it because the IT network flagged an unusual file conversion from his IP address." Sam stopped pacing and leaned over my desk. "Claire, I've already drafted an injunction. I can flag this to the Delaware State Registry right now. We can freeze the transfer before it clears escrow tomorrow morning. If we stop it now, he just looks like an idiot trying to pull a fast one." I stared at the forged signature. My husband wasn't just planning to leave me for my sister. He was planning to rob me blind on his way out, leaving me with nothing while he and Chloe walked away with $12 million of my hard-earned equity. He was attempting to gut me completely, assuming my parents would force me to accept it to avoid a scandal. The sheer, breathtaking malice of it was almost awe-inspiring. I slowly closed the manila folder. I looked up at Sam, my heart beating with a slow, heavy, predatory rhythm. "Don't stop it," I said. Sam blinked, confused. "Claire, did you hear me? If this clears escrow, that equity is gone. It belongs to Chloe legally." "Sam," I said softly, my voice calm and utterly devoid of mercy. "If we stop it now, it's an attempted civil dispute, a messy divorce detail, a family squabble." I tapped my perfectly manicured fingernail against the folder. But if we let the transfer clear tomorrow morning, I let the sentence hang in the air, watching understanding slowly dawn in Sam's eyes. If it clears, Sam whispered, his breath catching, he has officially used electronic communications across state lines to execute a fraudulent transfer of multi-million-dollar assets. Federal wire fraud, I confirmed, leaning back in my leather chair. Aggravated identity theft. Forgery of financial instruments. These aren't civil penalties, Sam. These are federal statutes. Mandatory minimum sentencing. He'll go to federal prison, Sam said, staring at me as if he were seeing me for the very first time. Yes, he will, I said, a cold, serene smile spreading across my face. He wants to give my sister a $12 million gift? Let him. Let the transaction finalize. Log every keystroke, secure the IP logs, and back up the timestamp of the vector file theft. I stood up, walked over to the window, and looked down at the bustling, ant-like traffic of Manhattan below. 2 months ago, I had been a woman drowning in a sea of betrayal, begging for scraps of love from people who viewed me as livestock. Now I was the one holding the leash. Let him hang himself, Sam, I instructed, never taking my eyes off the city. Because in 2 weeks at the Christmas Gala, I am going to kick the chair out from under him. The Harrington Annual Christmas Gala was not merely a holiday party. It was a carefully choreographed display of dominance. Held in the grand ballroom of my parents' Fifth Avenue townhouse, it was the night where New York's real estate elite, politicians, and our most prominent shareholders gathered to drink vintage champagne and kiss my father's ring. This year, the townhouse was transformed into a winter wonderland that smelled of fresh pine, expensive perfume, and unbridled arrogance. A 12-foot Douglas fir, dripping in Swarovski crystal ornaments, dominated the foyer. Waiters in white tuxedos circulated with silver trays of beluga caviar and truffles. A string quartet played softly in the corner, providing an elegant soundtrack to the gilded slaughterhouse I was about to open. I stood at the top of the grand sweeping staircase, looking down at the glittering crowd. For the past decade, I had attended this gala wearing muted, conservative black gowns, the dutiful invisible workhorse fading into the background so my family could shine. Tonight, I wore a bespoke floor-length gown the color of fresh blood. It was architectural, sharp, and utterly unapologetic. I had paired it with diamond drop earrings and a slash of crimson lipstick. When I finally descended the stairs, the quiet hum of conversation in the foyer noticeably faltered. Julian was waiting at the bottom, holding a glass of scotch. He looked impeccably handsome in a velvet dinner jacket, but as his eyes dragged over me, his confident smile slipped, replaced by a flicker of genuine unease. He wasn't used to seeing me look dangerous. "Claire," he said, clearing his throat and offering his arm. "You look spectacular. Different." "Thank you, Julian," I replied, my voice smooth as glass as I bypassed his arm entirely and plucked a flute of champagne from a passing waiter. It's a new era. Across the room, my sister Chloe was holding court with a group of junior executives. She was wearing a slinky silver dress that left very little to the imagination, and around her neck sat a stunning emerald pendant. I recognized it immediately. It was a vintage Cartier piece that had been auctioned at Sotheby's 3 weeks ago. It cost $85,000. It was paid for by Apex Solutions, one of Julian's fraudulent shell companies. My mother, Eleanor, caught my eye from across the room. She gave me a tight, approving nod. In her mind, the red dress was a sign that I was finally trying, finally attempting to be the vibrant wife Julian supposedly needed to keep his eyes from wandering back to her favorite daughter. Little did she know, the dress wasn't an invitation. It was a warning label. At 9 o'clock, the string quartet paused, and the low murmur of the crowd quieted as my father, Richard, stepped up to the acrylic podium set up in front of the massive fireplace. He tapped the microphone, his chest puffed out with the supreme confidence of a man who believed he owned the world. "Ladies and gentlemen, esteemed partners and friends," Richard began, his booming voice echoing off the marble floors. "Welcome to our home. Tonight is a celebration not just of the holiday season, but of the unprecedented growth of the Harrington Real Estate Group over the past year." Polite applause rippled through the room. I stood near the back, leaning against a marble pillar, A few feet away, leaning against the mahogany bar with a glass of club soda, was Victoria Vance. She caught my eye and gave a nearly imperceptible nod. The trap was set. As we look to the future, my father continued, gesturing expansively, we must acknowledge the need for fresh vision. We are a family company, and legacy is everything. That is why, effective January 1st, my beautiful daughter Chloe will be stepping up as our new Director of Corporate Communications. More applause. Chloe beamed, waving playfully at the crowd. And, Richard's voice swelled with pride, I am thrilled to announce the man who will be leading our strategic expansion. A man of integrity, vision, and relentless drive. My son-in-law, our Director of Business Development and the future CEO of the Harrington Group, Julian Sterling. The room erupted into enthusiastic applause. Julian buttoned his jacket, pasted on a humble aw-shucks smile, and began to make his way through the parting crowd toward the podium. He stopped to shake hands, basking in the adoration of the shareholders who believed he was making them rich. He reached the stage, shook my father's hand, and stepped up to the microphone. Thank you, Richard. Thank you all. I am deeply humbled. Family is the foundation of everything we do here. Without trust, without loyalty, we have nothing. How beautifully said, I projected. My voice wasn't a scream, but it cut through the lingering applause like a whip. The room fell dead silent. Hundreds of faces turned toward the back of the room to look at me. I set my champagne glass down on a side table and began a slow, deliberate walk down the center aisle toward the podium. The crowd parted for me instinctively. The blood-red silk of my gown whispered against the marble. Julian's smile froze. My father frowned, stepping forward. Claire, sweetheart, we're in the middle of the announcements. We can hear from the executive VP later. Oh, but Richard, I said, reaching the stage and stepping smoothly past Julian to take the microphone from his suddenly rigid hand. I think the executive VP needs to make an announcement right now, since Julian brought up the paramount importance of trust and loyalty. I looked out at the sea of faces. I saw the elite board members. I saw the city planners. I saw Victoria Vance watching me with the predatory stillness of a hawk. In my left hand, I held my phone. Sam Jenkins was logged into the master server from a van parked 3 blocks away, waiting for my signal. Tonight we are exchanging gifts, I said into the microphone, my voice echoing in the cavernous room. And I have prepared a very special holiday package for everyone in this room, particularly for the shareholders. I tapped the screen of my phone. For 3 agonizing seconds, nothing happened. And then, a sound began to ripple through the grand ballroom. Buzz, ding, chime. It started sparsely, then cascaded into a symphony of electronic alerts. Every single guest in the room, every board member, every media representative, every partner who had provided an email address on the guest list had just received a secure, encrypted file drop. People began pulling their phones out of their tuxedo pockets and evening bags. What you are looking at, I announced, my voice dropping into a register of absolute icy calm, is a comprehensive forensic audit of the Harrington Real Estate Group's development accounts over the past 14 months. You will find detailed ledgers from 3 companies, Apex Solutions, Horizon Logistics, and Vanguard Supply. They are dummy corporations, entirely fictitious, set up by our incoming CEO, Julian Sterling. A collective gasp sucked the air out of the room. Julian went completely pale, his jaw dropping open as he lunged toward me. Claire, what the hell are you doing? Turn that off. Don't touch me, I hissed, my eyes flashing with such venom that he physically recoiled. I turned back to the crowd. Through those shell companies, Julian has embezzled $2.4 million from our Brooklyn development funds backed by federal bridge loans. He used that money to purchase luxury vehicles, high-end real estate renovations, and the Cartier emerald pendant currently resting on my sister Chloe's neck. All eyes instantly snapped to Chloe. Her hand flew to her throat, her face draining of color. She looked like a deer caught in the headlights of a semi-truck. Furthermore, I continued, projecting over the rising, chaotic murmurs of the crowd, On page 4 of that PDF, you will find the time-stamped security footage of Julian and my sister, Chloe Harrington, enjoying a romantic getaway at our Aspen cabin. A getaway sanctioned and covered up by my mother, Eleanor Harrington, whose lovely voice you can hear directing the housekeeping staff on the audio file. The murmurs erupted into full-blown shouts. Board members were furiously scrolling through their phones, their faces twisting in horror and outrage. An older investor in the front row looked at my father with absolute disgust. My mother, Eleanor, gripped the back of a chair, looking as if she were about to faint. "Claire, stop this! You are having a nervous breakdown. Someone call security." "I am perfectly sane, Mother," I smiled. Which is why page 7 of the document contains the time-stamped proof of Julian forging my electronic signature yesterday morning to transfer $12 million of my joint equity into Chloe's private trust, a federal wire fraud offense that I have already reported to the FBI. Julian stumbled backward, literally knocking over a towering floral arrangement. The vase shattered on the marble, the sharp crack echoing like a gunshot. He was hyperventilating, his eyes darting wildly around the room, looking for an exit. "As of this moment," I declared, my voice soaring over the chaos, "I am resigning as executive vice president of this company. My divorce papers have already been filed with the New York State Supreme Court." I looked directly at my father, whose face had turned a dangerous apoplectic shade of purple. "And finally," I said softly, but the microphone picked up every lethal syllable, "I am not the only one leaving. Victoria Vance and the 5 largest investment portfolios underwriting this firm, totaling $37 million, have officially terminated their contracts due to gross negligence and breach of fiduciary duty. Harrington Group is officially insolvent." The ballroom exploded. It was absolute, unmitigated pandemonium. Investors were shouting at my father. Reporters who had been invited for a fluff piece were frantically recording the scene on their phones. Richard Harrington realized in a terrifying heartbeat that his empire was crumbling to dust before his eyes. The Vanguard investors were screaming about SEC investigations. The federal loans were breached. Survival instinct kicked in. Richard didn't run to me to apologize. He didn't run to comfort his weeping golden child, Chloe. He turned on Julian like a rabid dog. "You parasitic son of a bitch!" Richard roared, grabbing the microphone from the stand and pointing a shaking finger at Julian. "You stole from us. You manipulated my daughter. You defrauded this company. You are fired, effective immediately. We will prosecute you to the fullest extent of the law. Security, get this criminal out of my house." Julian stood frozen by the shattered vase, surrounded by hostile, glaring billionaires. He looked at Richard, then at Eleanor, who was nodding frantically, backing away from Julian as if he were contagious. They were cutting him loose. They were going to feed him to the feds to save their own skins. And right there, under the glittering lights of the chandelier, the cornered rat bared his teeth. "You hypocritical old bastard!" Julian screamed, his voice cracking with panic and rage. He didn't run. Instead, he lunged toward the podium, shoving my father aside to grab the microphone. "You think I did this alone?" Julian shouted, addressing the furious board members. "You think Richard didn't know about the missing millions? Look at the second attachment on your phones. Look at the Cayman Islands accounts." My father froze. The purple in his face drained, leaving him chalk white. "Julian, shut your mouth." "No!" Julian roared, pointing at his father-in-law. "Richard signed off on every single fraudulent invoice. He knew I was skimming the Brooklyn funds because he was taking a 40% cut. He has $5 million in underground gambling debts in Macau. The Harrington Group hasn't been profitable in 3 years. Eleanor has been using the corporate pension fund as her personal checking account to buy offshore real estate in Dubai." The silence that fell over the room this time was different. It wasn't shock. It was the heavy, breathless silence of a crime scene. "He's lying!" Eleanor shrieked, her perfectly manicured facade completely shattering. She looked wild, desperate. "He's a liar and a thief! The wire transfers are in the file." Julian laughed, a manic, hysterical sound that bordered on a sob. "I kept the real ledgers. If I go down for wire fraud, you two are going to federal prison for embezzlement and pension fraud right next to me. We're all going down together. I stepped back from the podium, retreating into the shadows of the massive Christmas tree. I watched as the wealthy, elite guests began to physically back away from the Harrington family, forming a wide circle of condemnation around them. Chloe was sobbing on the floor, clutching her stolen emerald necklace. Julian was screaming obscenities at my father. And my parents, the untouchable, arrogant architects of my misery, were violently screaming back, tearing each other apart in front of the entire city. It was a bloodbath, an exquisite, self-inflicted massacre. I didn't gloat. I didn't say another word. I simply turned around, picked up my coat from the coat check attendant, who was staring at the ballroom in slack-jawed shock, and walked out the front door into the freezing December night. A sleek black Maybach was idling at the curb. The rear door swung open. Victoria Vance was sitting inside, 2 crystal glasses of bourbon already poured. I climbed into the car, the heavy door thudding shut, instantly cutting off the sounds of the screaming, sirens, and chaos echoing from the townhouse. "Well," Victoria said smoothly, handing me a glass, "I believe that went rather well." I took a sip of the bourbon. It burned on the way down, leaving a trail of absolute, blazing warmth. "It's just the beginning," I replied, looking out the tinted window as the first police cruisers began pulling up to my parents' house with their lights flashing. Now we let them burn in the ashes. The collapse of an empire doesn't happen in slow motion. When the structural integrity finally fails, the descent is violent, catastrophic, and deafeningly fast. By 9 o'clock the morning after the Christmas gala, the Harrington Real Estate Group was bleeding out on the front page of the Wall Street Journal. The headline didn't mince words. "Family Feud uncovers massive fraud. Harrington execs face federal probes." I sat in the sleek, minimalist conference room of Victoria Vance's penthouse offices, drinking black coffee and watching the financial news networks cover the slaughter. The Securities and Exchange Commission had moved with terrifying speed, freezing the Harrington corporate accounts before the sun even came up. By noon, a fleet of black SUVs had pulled up to the Harrington headquarters in Midtown. Agents from the FBI's white-collar crime division carried out dozens of cardboard boxes filled with hard drives, physical ledgers, and encrypted servers. Sam Jenkins had conveniently left the master administrative passwords taped to the server racks before he resigned. My parents' Fifth Avenue townhouse, the site of their spectacular public immolation the night before, was currently surrounded by a swarm of paparazzi and local news vans. Richard and Eleanor were trapped inside their gilded cage, their assets frozen pending a massive federal investigation into pension embezzlement and corporate tax evasion. "They suspended trading on Harrington stock an hour ago," Victoria noted, walking into the room and tossing a tablet onto the glass table. "It was down 42%. Your father's personal net worth just evaporated on paper." "It was never real money anyway," I replied, taking a slow sip of my coffee. "It was leverage built on lies. I just turned on the lights so the bank could see the rot." While my parents were barricaded in their home with their crisis PR team, Julian was experiencing a very different, much colder reality check. At 2 o'clock that afternoon, Julian sat in the mahogany-paneled office of a high-powered criminal defense attorney in Lower Manhattan. He had gone there expecting to write a massive retainer check from his personal accounts to secure his freedom. What he received instead was an education in the fine print of hubris. I knew exactly how that meeting went, because my own divorce attorney forwarded me the frantic, hysterical emails Julian's counsel started sending an hour later. When my father forced Julian to sign our prenuptial agreement 7 years ago, Richard's only goal had been to protect the Harrington Company shares from a potential divorce. He had mandated a ruthless, ironclad separation of assets. What belonged to Claire before and during the marriage remained solely Claire's. What Julian earned, his salary, his bonuses, was his. But Julian had just been terminated for gross misconduct and felony fraud. His severance package was voided. The $2.4 million he had embezzled through his shell companies? Frozen and seized by the federal government under asset forfeiture laws. The joint trust he had tried to forge my signature to steal? Safely locked down by Sam Jenkins's injunction. Julian had nothing. No equity, no savings that weren't instantly flagged by the feds, and because the apartment we lived in was purchased entirely with my executive bonuses and titled in my name. He had no home. My lawyers had changed the locks and served him with an emergency eviction notice filed under the premise of criminal activity on the premises. He was a 40-year-old man facing 20 years in a federal penitentiary, and his debit card had just been declined at a midtown coffee shop. Panic makes people desperate, and desperation always drives a parasite back to its host. That night, a brutal winter storm battered New York City, dumping 6 inches of snow onto the streets. At around 10 o'clock, Julian showed up at the luxury Tribeca apartment he had helped my sister renovate. I wasn't there, of course, but the building's doorman, whom I had tipped extremely well for years, happily provided a detailed account to my security team, and the rest was easily deduced from the furious, unhinged voicemails Julian left on my phone later that night. Julian arrived at Chloe's door shivering, his velvet dinner jacket from the night before offering zero protection against the biting wind. He expected a sanctuary. He expected the beautiful, adoring woman who had whispered promises of a shared empire in his ear in Aspen. He expected Chloe to wrap her arms around him, tell him it was going to be okay, and offer up her pristine, untouched trust fund to hire his defense team and flee to a non-extradition country. When Chloe opened the door, she wasn't wearing lingerie or offering comfort. She was wearing sweatpants, her face pale and devoid of makeup, and the living room behind her was a chaotic mess of open Louis Vuitton trunks and frantic packing. "Chloe, thank God," Julian gasped, pushing his way into the apartment. His teeth were chattering. "My accounts are frozen. The feds took my passport, but I have a guy who can get us a private charter to the Caymans if we move tonight. We just need to wire the pilot $50,000 from your account." "Are you out of your mind?" Chloe snapped, backing away from him as if he were carrying a plague. Julian stopped, blinking at her in the warm light of the foyer. The reality of her tone hadn't quite registered through his panic. "Chloe, baby, it's me. It's us. Richard and Eleanor are going down. Claire is out of the picture. We can finally be together, just like we planned." "Planned?" Chloe shrieked, her voice echoing off the Italian marble floors he had picked out for her. "We planned on you being the CEO. We planned on you transferring $12 million into my account. You didn't tell me you were leaving a paper trail a mile wide for my psychotic sister to find." "I did it for you," Julian pleaded, reaching for her arms. "I bought you the Cartier. I bought you this apartment. Everything I did to give you the life you deserve." "You did it with stolen money, you idiot," Chloe screamed, violently slapping his hands away. "And now the FBI has my name on a subpoena. My friends won't return my calls. Mom and Dad's lawyers told me not to speak to you. You're toxic, Julian. You have nothing. You are nothing." Julian stared at the woman he had thrown away his marriage for. The illusion shattered right there in the entryway. Chloe didn't love him. She had never loved him. She had loved the proximity to power. She had loved the thrill of taking something that belonged to her older sister. She loved the shiny, expensive things he bought her. But a broke, shivering felon facing a decades-long prison sentence? That was a liability she was entirely unequipped to handle. "I threw away my life for you," Julian whispered, his voice trembling with a terrifying mixture of heartbreak and rage. "Oh, please," Chloe sneered, crossing her arms over her chest. The ugly, spoiled entitlement that my parents had cultivated in her for 26 years was finally exposed in all its grotesque glory. "You didn't throw anything away. You got caught. And I am 26 years old, Julian. I am beautiful, and I have my entire life ahead of me. I am not spending my best years visiting you behind a plexiglass wall in a federal prison. Now get out of my apartment before I call the police and tell them you're trespassing." "Chloe, get out!" she screamed, grabbing a heavy brass bookend from the console table and hurling it at him. It missed his head by inches, shattering the hallway mirror. Julian backed out into the hallway. Chloe slammed the heavy oak door in his face, the sound echoing down the quiet, exclusive corridor like a gunshot. He was left standing in the hallway, dripping melted snow onto the expensive carpet, completely and utterly alone. 3 days later, the reality of her own situation finally began to set in for Chloe. With Julian gone and the Harrington corporate accounts seized, the golden child suddenly found herself without her endless supply of credit. Her American Express Centurion card, paid out of the company's marketing budget, was declined at a Madison Avenue boutique. The contractor for her apartment walked off the job because the final wire transfer bounced. Panic, absolute and unadulterated, took hold of her. She realized that with our parents facing indictment, their assets were locked tight. She couldn't ask them for cash. But Chloe wasn't entirely stupid. She remembered the safety net, the Harrington Family Trust. It was a $50 million generational wealth fund established by our grandfather, Arthur Harrington, decades ago. It was designed to pay out dividends to the Harrington heirs when they reached the age of 25. Chloe had turned 25 last year, and she knew her portion of the principal, roughly $12 million, was sitting in a high-yield account at a private wealth management bank on Wall Street. On Thursday morning, Chloe marched into the hushed, velvet-lined lobby of the private bank, wearing a pair of dark, oversized sunglasses and clutching her Hermes Kelly bag. She demanded to see the senior wealth manager. She wanted to liquidate her portion of the trust, take the cash, and move to Paris until the federal investigations in New York blew over. She was escorted into a private, soundproof glass office. A few minutes later, the heavy glass door opened, but it wasn't the wealth manager who walked in. It was me. I was wearing a sharp, tailored white suit, carrying a sleek leather portfolio. I closed the door behind me and locked it. Chloe ripped her sunglasses off, her eyes wide with shock and immediate defensive anger. "What are you doing here? Where is Mr. Sterling? I specifically asked for my portfolio manager." "Mr. Sterling is currently on a conference call with the bank's legal compliance team," I said calmly, walking around the large mahogany desk and taking the high-backed leather chair usually reserved for the banker. I placed my portfolio on the desk. "He won't be joining us." "You can't do this," Chloe snapped, standing up. "You don't work here. You don't control my trust fund. That money was left to me by Grandpa Arthur. You can't touch it." "You're right, Chloe. I don't control the trust," I agreed, folding my hands neatly on the desk. "Grandpa Arthur controls it. Or rather, his incredibly meticulous legal foresight does." Chloe frowned, crossing her arms. "What are you talking about?" "Grandpa Arthur was a very traditional man," I began, my voice taking on the patient, educational tone one might use with a slow child. "He built his fortune in the 1950s. He believed in the Harrington name. He believed in legacy, reputation, and, above all, family honor. When he established the generational trust, he didn't just hand over $50 million blindly. He wanted to ensure that his wealth didn't fund the moral decay of his descendants." Chloe's face twitched. A faint sheen of sweat appeared on her forehead. "Just tell them to wire the money, Claire. I'm leaving the country. You've ruined Mom and Dad. You've ruined Julian. You won. Just give me my money and you'll never have to see me again." "I opened the trust documents on Monday," I continued, ignoring her plea entirely. "There is a specific addendum buried on page 42. It's called a morality clause." Chloe stopped breathing. She stared at me, the blood draining from her face. "A morality clause," I repeated softly, enjoying the taste of the words. "It explicitly states that any beneficiary of the Harrington Family Trust shall forfeit their right to all principal and future dividends if they engage in, and I quote, acts of gross moral turpitude, felony financial fraud, or behaviors that bring severe public disgrace and shame upon the Harrington family name." You can't," Chloe whispered, her voice barely audible. "The clause," I went on, opening my leather portfolio, "specifically highlights adultery that destroys the sanctity of a family marriage. It also highlights complicity in the theft of family assets." I pulled out a thick stack of papers and slid them across the polished mahogany desk toward her. "Yesterday morning, I had my attorneys submit a formal petition to the independent board of trustees who oversee Grandpa Arthur's fund. I provided them with the time-stamped video of you sleeping with my husband in the Aspen cabin. I provided them with the audio of your mother facilitating the affair. I provided them with the SEC indictments regarding the embezzlement that funded your Cartier necklaces and your apartment renovations. And I provided them with the front pages of 6 major newspapers detailing the absolute, unprecedented disgrace you and our parents have brought upon the Harrington name. Chloe reached out with a trembling hand and touched the edge of the papers. She looked like she was going to be sick. The Board of Trustees held an emergency vote last night, I said, leaning forward, my voice dropping to a whisper that cut through the silence of the room like a razor blade. It was unanimous, Chloe. No, she gasped, tears finally spilling over her eyelashes. Claire, please, it's all I have left. The morality clause has been formally invoked, I stated, delivering the final, fatal blow without a single ounce of hesitation. Your status as a beneficiary has been permanently revoked. Furthermore, because Richard and Eleanor are currently under federal indictment for defrauding the corporate pension, their status has been suspended as well. According to Grandpa's stipulations, when the clause is invoked against the primary beneficiaries, the entire remaining balance of the trust, all $50 million, is to be immediately liquidated. Chloe fell back into her chair, her hands covering her mouth, her chest heaving with silent, hyperventilating sobs. Where does it go? She choked out. To the secondary beneficiary designated by the estate, I smiled. The New York Children's Hospital Foundation. I believe they are naming the new oncology wing after Grandpa Arthur. It's a beautiful legacy. You took everything, she sobbed, burying her face in her hands. You took everything from me. I didn't take anything, I replied, standing up and buttoning my suit jacket. I just stopped paying for your mistakes, and Julian isn't around to steal for you anymore. I picked up my portfolio and walked toward the door. I paused with my hand on the glass handle, looking back at the weeping, broken girl who had spent her entire life standing on my shoulders, believing she was taller than me. You're 26 years old, Chloe, I said, my voice echoing the exact cruel, dismissive tone our mother had used on me for decades. You have your whole life ahead of you. I hear the luxury boutiques on Fifth Avenue are hiring sales associates for the holiday rush. You already know the inventory. You should drop off a resume. I opened the door and walked out of the private bank, leaving my sister to drown in the absolute crushing reality of a world where she finally had to pay her own way. The air outside on Wall Street was freezing, but as I hailed a cab to take me back to my new firm, I felt nothing but the intoxicating, radiant heat of absolute victory. The Harrington Castle had completely burned to the ground, and I was the only one walking out of the ashes alive. 6 months later, New York City thawed. The bitter, suffocating winter that had frozen the Harrington Empire gave way to a brilliant, sun-drenched June. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of my corner office, looking out over the panoramic expanse of the Manhattan skyline. The office was located on the 68th floor of a newly constructed glass tower in Hudson Yards. There was no heavy mahogany here, no Persian rugs, no smell of old scotch. No ghosts of a toxic legacy. Everything in the headquarters of Sterling and Vance Consulting was sleek steel, white marble, and unobstructed, blinding daylight. I took a sip of my espresso, watching the tiny yellow cabs navigating the grid far below. The corporate autopsy of the Harrington Real Estate Group had been a spectacular, highly publicized bloodletting. Once the SEC and the FBI began unraveling the threads of my father's phantom ledgers and Julian's shell companies, the entire structure collapsed with terrifying speed. The Vanguard investors had filed a massive class action lawsuit, effectively forcing the company into Chapter 11 bankruptcy to liquidate its assets and pay off the defrauded federal banks. That was when Victoria Vance and I had swooped back in. Through our newly established firm, we attended the closed-door bankruptcy auctions. We purchased the crown jewels of the Harrington portfolio, including the Lower Manhattan commercial development I had personally negotiated, for 20 cents on the dollar. It was perfectly legal, utterly ruthless, and incredibly profitable. By spring, Sterling and Vance had doubled its valuation, and I was sitting in the CEO's chair, answering to no one but myself. The people who had once treated me as an expendable asset were experiencing a very different reality. Julian's grand illusions of wealth and power had evaporated inside a 6-by-8-foot concrete cell at the Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn. He had been denied bail. The federal prosecutors argued successfully that his attempts to wire $12 million to offshore accounts made him an extreme flight risk. His high-priced defense attorney had dropped him the moment the retainer check bounced, leaving him in the hands of an overworked public defender. According to the legal briefs my lawyers monitored, Julian had tried to strike a plea deal by offering to testify against my parents. But the FBI already had Sam Jenkins' meticulously categorized server logs and the offshore wire receipts. Julian had no leverage. He had nothing left to trade. He was staring down a mandatory minimum of 15 years in federal prison for wire fraud, bank fraud, and aggravated identity theft. The man who had worn Tom Ford suits and played golf at exclusive country clubs was now wearing an orange jumpsuit, eating terrible cafeteria food, and sleeping on a thin mattress, completely forgotten by the society he had tried to steal from. And then there was Chloe. Without the Harrington family trust, without Julian's embezzled credit cards, and without our parents' protection, the golden child had been violently ejected from her gilded cage. The luxury Tribeca apartment had been seized by the banks. Her friends in the elite socialite circles had blocked her number the moment her name appeared in the federal indictments. I had heard through the grapevine that she was currently living in a cramped 3-bedroom apartment in a rundown neighborhood in Queens, surrounded by roommates she despised. She had indeed found a job in retail, but not at a luxury boutique on Fifth Avenue. No high-end brand wanted a Harrington on their sales floor. Instead, she was working the cosmetics counter at a mid-tier department store in a suburban mall in New Jersey. She spent 10 hours a day on her feet, wearing an uncomfortable polyester uniform, forced to smile and apply cheap foundation to women who yelled at her over expired coupons. She was earning a base minimum wage, desperate for commission, living paycheck to paycheck. It was the exact life she had always viewed with sneering, aristocratic contempt. A soft chime from the intercom on my desk pulled me from my thoughts. "Ms. Sterling," came the crisp, professional voice of my executive assistant, Maya. "I apologize for the interruption, but there are 2 individuals at the reception desk demanding to see you. They do not have an appointment." "Who are they, Maya?" I asked, though a quiet instinct already knew the answer. "A Mr. Richard and Mrs. Eleanor Harrington. Building security stopped them in the lobby, but they are causing quite a scene, claiming it's a family emergency. Shall I have them escorted off the premises?" I looked at the reflection of my office in the glass window. I saw a woman who was calm, powerful, and entirely untouchable. I didn't feel the old familiar knot of anxiety in my stomach. I didn't feel fear. "No," I said smoothly. "Send them up, but have a security guard escort them to the outer glass conference room. Do not bring them into my personal office." "Understood, Ms. Sterling." I took my time. I finished my espresso. I adjusted the cuffs of my tailored navy blazer, picked up a sleek digital tablet, and walked out of my office. The glass conference room was located right off the main reception area, completely transparent to the rest of the bustling executive floor. When I walked in, I almost didn't recognize the 2 people standing nervously by the polished concrete table. Richard Harrington looked like a deflated balloon. The booming, arrogant patriarch was gone. He had lost at least 20 pounds, and his skin hung loosely on his jawline. He was wearing an off-the-rack suit that was clearly a few sizes too big, and the collar of his shirt was frayed. My mother, Eleanor, looked even worse. The woman who had once spent 3 hours a day at the salon now had stark gray roots showing through her blonde hair. Her posture, once impeccably rigid, was stooped. She was clutching a worn leather handbag as if it were a life preserver. They smelled of cheap soap and stale anxiety. The federal indictments had frozen every single one of their assets. They had been evicted from the Fifth Avenue townhouse months ago and were currently renting a small, grim apartment near LaGuardia Airport while they awaited their criminal trials for pension fraud. When I entered the room, my mother took a step forward, a desperate, trembling smile stretching across her face. "Claire, sweetheart," she breathed, her eyes welling with tears. "Oh, look at you. Look at this place. We are so incredibly proud of you." I didn't smile back. I didn't offer my hand. I simply stood at the head of the table, looking at them with the mild, detached curiosity of a scientist observing an invasive species of insect. "Ms. Sterling," I corrected her, my voice quiet and utterly devoid of warmth. "Inside this building, you will address me as Ms. Sterling. What do you want?" Richard flinched, his shoulders sagging further. He placed a trembling hand on the back of a chair, but didn't sit down. "Claire, Ms. Sterling, please. We didn't come here to fight. We came here to beg." "A novel concept for you, Richard," I noted dryly. "But my time is billed at $2,000 an hour. I suggest you get to the point." Eleanor let out a ragged sob, pulling a tissue from her purse. "It's the lawyers, Claire. The legal fees are drowning us. The public defenders don't care about our case. They're telling us we might actually have to serve time. We have nothing left. We're eating canned soup. Your father's heart condition is acting up, and we can't afford his private cardiologist anymore." I listened to her litany of woes, waiting for the familiar surge of guilt that had dictated my entire adult life. I waited for the instinct to reach for my checkbook, to fix their problems, to buy their conditional affection. Nothing happened. The well was completely, entirely dry. "That is unfortunate," I said flatly. "But as you recall from the Christmas gala, I resigned from the Harrington Group. I am no longer your executive vice president, and I am certainly no longer your ATM. Your legal and medical bills are not my concern." "We know we made mistakes," Richard suddenly burst out, his voice cracking with a pathetic, reedy desperation. "We were blind. Julian manipulated us, Claire. He manipulated all of us. We should have listened to you. We should have protected you. We are your parents. Please, you have to help us. Blood is thicker than water." I tilted my head, studying the sheer hypocrisy etched into the deep lines of his face. "Julian didn't manipulate you, Richard," I said, my voice dropping to a lethal, icy whisper. "Julian gave you exactly what you wanted. He gave you a scapegoat to run your company while you played golf, and he gave you a distraction for your spoiled daughter. You didn't just fail to protect me. You actively participated in my emotional execution." I turned my gaze to my mother. She shrank back under the weight of my stare. "You told him to change the linens," I reminded her softly. "You told my husband to wash my sister's scent out of my bed so I wouldn't stop funding your lifestyle. You sold me out for a Porsche, so do not stand in my office and invoke the sanctity of blood." Eleanor began to openly weep, her shoulders shaking. "We're sorry. We're so sorry, Claire. We've lost everything." "Not everything," I replied, glancing at my tablet. "You still have your golden child. How is Chloe doing?" The mention of Chloe seemed to strike a fresh, raw nerve. Eleanor looked up, her face twisted in genuine anguish. It was the only real emotion I had seen from her in my entire life. She's not doing well, Claire," my mother choked out. "She's working at a mall in New Jersey. Her manager is cruel to her. She has blisters on her feet. She cries every night on the phone. She's not built for that kind of life. She's delicate." I let out a short, sharp laugh. The sheer absurdity of it was staggering. They were facing federal prison, living in squalor, and their primary concern was still Chloe's comfort. "She's 26, I stated. She's an adult. Working a retail job isn't a human rights violation. It's reality. Most people do it every day without crying. She made a terrible mistake," Richard pleaded, stepping forward, his hands clasped together. "She was young and stupid, but she's your sister. Please, Claire, we aren't asking for money for ourselves. We'll face whatever the courts decide. But Chloe, please, give her a job here. At your new firm, just a consulting role, an entry-level position, something to get her out of that mall and back on her feet. You have so much power now. You can save her." I looked at them. Really looked at them. For 36 years, they had programmed me to believe that my only value on this earth was to serve as the foundation for Chloe's happiness. Even now, completely ruined and begging in the halls of my empire, they were still trying to run the same script. They still expected me to carry her. "No," I said. The word hung in the air, absolute and immovable. Richard blinked, stunned. "Claire, please." "I said no," I repeated, my tone as hard as diamonds. I will not hire her. I will not give her a loan. I will not provide a character reference. Chloe actively participated in a plot to steal $12 million of my personal equity so she could run away with my husband. The fact that she is currently selling cheap lipstick in New Jersey instead of sitting in a federal women's prison alongside Julian is the only mercy she will ever receive from me. "You are a monster," Eleanor whispered, her sorrow instantly curdling back into the familiar venomous hatred she had always harbored for me. "She is your own flesh and blood. You are cold. You have always been a cold, unnatural, calculating bitch." I smiled, a genuine, radiant smile that reached all the way to my eyes. "Yes," I agreed softly. "I am. You spent my entire life teaching me how to be cold, Eleanor. You taught me how to calculate value. You taught me that love is transactional and loyalty is a liability. You forged me into a machine to build your wealth." I stepped back from the table, walking toward the glass door. "You just didn't calculate what would happen when the machine realized it didn't need you anymore." I opened the door and signaled to the two large, imposing security guards standing in the reception area. They immediately stepped forward. "Ms. Sterling has another meeting," I told the guards. "Please escort these two visitors out of the building, permanently." "You can't do this!" Richard yelled, his face turning red as the guards took him firmly by the elbows. "Claire, we are your family. You owe us." "I don't owe you a damn thing," I said, turning my back on them. I didn't watch them being dragged toward the elevator. I didn't listen to my mother's hysterical screaming or my father's pathetic threats. I simply tuned out the noise, walked back down the pristine, quiet hallway, and returned to my corner office. I closed the heavy oak door behind me, letting the absolute silence of the room wash over me. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows and pressed my hand against the cool, thick glass. Far below, the city was alive, millions of people rushing to meetings, fighting for their dreams, building their own lives. For the first time in 36 years, I wasn't carrying the weight of a toxic legacy on my shoulders. I wasn't funding a lie. I wasn't hiding in the shadows of a gilded cage. I had burned the cage to the ground, and I had used the ashes to build a skyscraper. The air in the room smelled like fresh espresso and absolute, unconditional freedom. I looked at my reflection in the glass one last time. I wasn't the workhorse anymore. I wasn't the scapegoat. I was the architect of my own destiny, and it was a beautiful day to build an empire. Thank you so much for listening to this story. If you found yourself rooting for this kind of justice, or if you've ever had to walk away from a toxic situation to find your own worth, please hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. It helps the channel grow and allows me to keep bringing you these stories. Leave a comment below and let me know what your favorite moment was. Stay strong, know your value, and I'll see you in the next one.